In this morning's Money Watch, the federal government may be $14 trillion in debt, but it's never had to juggle its bills until now. The U.S. Treasury can no longer legally borrow any money, and it says that could sink the economic recovery. CBS News business and economics correspondent Rebecca Jarvis is here with more on what all this means. Rebecca, good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Krista. We're really at a major tipping point here. The Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner spoke to a New York audience Tuesday and laid out a dire scenario. Congress either raises the debt ceiling by early August, or we could all pay a devastating price.
With our nation's credit limit now breached, Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner warned that a failure to act would result in disaster.
We do not have the option of leaving this problem to another day, another Congress, or another president.
Since Monday, when we hit the $14.3 trillion debt ceiling and Congress failed to raise it, Geithner's had to shuffle costs to keep the country afloat.
We were forced to deploy a series of extraordinary measures to prevent default.
Those measures include borrowing from 2 federal pensions and halting some state aid.
We have hit the debt ceiling, but it's not doing any damage because the Treasury can use various accounting gimmickry and techniques to get around the ceiling, but that only can go on for so long.
Think of it like you would your own home budget. Each month, bills need to be paid, groceries, gas, and of course the mortgage. But let's say you don't have the money to pay the bills, and your credit cards are maxed out. You have to feed the family and get around, so you put off those mortgage payments. Put them off for too long, and you'll find yourself in foreclosure. The government's version of a foreclosure happens August 2nd.
The scenarios come August 2nd are so dire. The words being bandied about are catastrophic, doomsday. And, these are appropriate terms.
The doomsday scenario means the U.S. would default on its debt for the first time in history, causing interest rates to soar, stocks to plummet, and a global recession worse than 2008's.
The big question going forward is how do we get to that vote? Now, the Republicans say that they're not going to hike the debt limit without guarantees on future spending cuts. Meantime, Democrats are pushing for an increase in the debt ceiling first, followed by talks about cutting the deficit later.
Let's say this stalemate lasts right up until that August 2nd deadline. What's this going to mean for the average American out there?
Bottom line here is that the more nervous that the markets get over this, the more likely the cost of borrowing is going to go up. So the more expensive your mortgage gets, the more expensive borrowing for a car or borrowing for a small business. On the flip side of that, stocks hate the uncertainty, and we could certainly see them push lower as a result of it.
China today warned the United States against attempting a technical debt default to force further spending cuts in the U.S. The idea of a technical default, essentially delaying interest payments for a few weeks, is gaining popularity with the Republicans. Beijing, which incidentally is the largest holder of U.S. assets, says any such move will destabilize global growth, and it has said that the U.S. is playing with fire. That's the exact comment made by a Chinese official. Analysts, of course, believe such a move will have disastrous consequences, sending the world back into recession. The U.S. deficit will touch $1.4 trillion this year, and the Treasury will run out of borrowing money by the 2nd of August. The Republicans and Democrats are yet to reach an agreement on raising the debt ceiling. All right, over to New York then, where we've got Ed Rombach, who's a markets analyst with Thomson Reuters, who he joins us on the show with his perspective on this story. Now, Republicans in the U.S. are discussing a technical debt default that would then effectively force the White House to accept deeper spending cuts. But what would you believe the impact of such an action could essentially be on global markets?
Well, it's a great question. I think talk of a technical default or default in U.S. debt is nonsense, and solvency is really not the issue because the U.S. can issue debt in its own currency, which it can print in unlimited supply. The real problem is that if you overprint the money, you get inflation, and which some would call default by another name. So that's what's shaping up. I believe there's going to be a deal to arrive at a solution to the debt ceiling before we have a problem, and I think the markets believe that too. Otherwise, a 10-year Treasury note wouldn't be trading below 3% yield, and U.S. sovereign credit default swap protection would be soaring, which it isn't.
Right, Ed, but looking at this a little differently, should one read this as the arrogance of a country that firmly believes that even if it opted for a technical default, world markets will have little option but to continue to subscribe to U.S. Treasury sales?
Well, it's another great question because, see, that's the benefit of having the reserve currency. See, the rest of the world sends America goods and products that they can't afford to consume themselves. In exchange, we give fiat currency, which really has no intrinsic value. And as President Nixon's Treasury Secretary, John Connally, once put it, the dollar, it might be our dollar, but it's your problem.
Right, and you know, separately, China has actually come out and said that the U.S. is playing with fire, to quote a senior Chinese government official. Now, considering that China has 2/3 of its foreign currency assets parked in U.S. treasuries, does this have the potential of snowballing into a political standoff between the two countries? That is, should the U.S. actually resort to a technical default?
Well, there's a lot of saber rattling, probably, you know, within Congress and within China, you know, saying that we're playing with fire. But I believe a deal is in the making, if not already made. And that deal is that there will be no QE3. And the idea here is to avoid putting further selling pressure on the dollar.